Once in a long while, if you are a lucky man, there comes a film that grabs you and twists you and wrings you and wrecks you. With these words, the Motion Picture World's independent film journal joins the dialogue, centering on one of the most complex and ambitious films of recent times, a film which Time calls part epic allegory, part light-hearted Brechtian morality play, part three-ring circus. During the coming hour, this broadcast joins that dialogue, exploring with the movie's makers their attitudes, inspirations, methods, hopes, achievements in putting together what for New York Magazine is this triumphant film, funnier and sadder at a second. The film's makers, sitting for our sound portrait, are director Lindsay Anderson, its star Malcolm McDowell, and composer Alan Price. Their film is the British entry in the 1973 Cannes Film Festival, Warner Brothers' Oh, Lucky Man.
If you have a friend on whom you think you can rely, you are a lucky man. If you found the reason to live on and not to die, you are a lucky man. Preachers and poets and scholars don't know it. Temples and statues and steeples won't show it. If you got the secret, just try not to blow it. Stay a lucky man. A lucky man.
This is Sound on Film, another in a series of broadcasts on films and the people who make them. Today's Sound on Film, program number 22, Oh Lucky Man and the Men Who Made It. Lindsay Anderson, Malcolm McDowell, Alan Price, in conversation with film commentator James Delson. James Delson founded the Film Research Archive and amassed over 500,000 articles, reviews, and interviews on film and film people over the past 5 years. They serve as his source material for articles on cinema in Show, Crawdaddy, True, Gallery, and other magazines, as well as for his weekly radio program, Critics Showcase. A filmmaker himself, James Delson is now at work on a short comedy, The Magic Hamburger Film. In a moment, the makers of Oh Lucky Man.
Takers and fakers and talkers won't tell you. Teachers and preachers will just buy and sell you. When no one can tempt you with heaven or hell, you'll be a lucky man. You'd be better by far to be just what you are. You can be what you want if you are what you are, and that's a lucky man. Oh yeah, a lucky man. And that's a lucky man. A lucky man. When there's a blue.
I'm Erwin Frankel, executive producer of Sound on Film. On an April weekend in 1973, I joined student editors, writers, and filmmakers from 75 American universities on the campus of Yale University for the premiere of Oh Lucky Man under the auspices of the Yale Film Society. From that time on, Oh Lucky Man has become the focus of a continuing critical and journalistic examination of its meaning and effect. Referring to Oh Lucky Man as a furious, all-encompassing, lengthy retelling of the Candide myth, the Independent Film Journal suggests that the only comparable film to it in recent years is Kubrick's 2001, which used the idea of Ulysses, the wanderer, in much the same way this film uses Candide, the believer. But this 1970s Candide's quest is not so much for learning as for success. Calling Oh Lucky Man a hip fairy tale masquerading as social satire, Rex Reed sees it as a comic overview of world crises, rich, dexterous, and musical, whose coffee salesman main character, encountering a society that seduces, punishes, and experiments on him, falls into experiences sensual and spiritual, like an ant in marmalade. And for critic Jay Cox, Oh Lucky Man is a streamlined pilgrim's progress, a journey through a society that is both recognizable and out of joint, where business meetings can turn into blasé conferences on genocide. His timepiece joins in the unanimous praise of Oh Lucky Man's music, calling Alan Price's songs jauntily savage, providing musical comment and counterpoint. In her New York Magazine column, Today, film critic Judith Crist thanks Lindsay Anderson and company for giving us the world of Watergate, as she calls it, in this sparklingly witty, heartbreakingly deceptive 3-hour film. To her, a unique creation and one of the best motion pictures of the post-Strangelove decade.
Sell, 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 sell everything you stand for. Tell, 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 tell all the people that you care for. Running here, running there, keep it moving, sonny, don't despair, because the next one will be, the next one will be, the next one will be the best one of the year.
Oh Lucky Man reunites director Lindsay Anderson with Malcolm McDowell, who established himself as an exceptional screen actor as Mick Travis, the rebel schoolboy in If, Anderson's 1969 Cannes Festival Grand Prix winning film. The central character of Oh Lucky Man has the same name, but this Mick Travis has crossed into the wider world of the 1970s, his fierce sense of independence somewhat gentled into innocence. The romantic Mick Travis of If, blazing away at the bounds of his schoolboy world, has given way to the coffee-selling, ambition-laden older Mick Travis, leaving the school for the world, perhaps journeying to an understanding to like the way things have of coming about of their own accord when you give them a gentle push. Before his feature film debut in 1963 with The Sporting Life, Lindsay Anderson was a leading critic and documentary filmmaker. In the years since If, Anderson has pursued his equally distinguished stage career. He is an associate director at London's Royal Court Theatre, directing 4 David Story plays, 3 of which, The Contractor, Home, and The Changing Room, have moved from London's West End to the United States. Acknowledging the immense fund of time and energy that filmmaking consumes, Anderson has been quoted as saying that Oh Lucky Man would be his last film. Whether or not that is so, it is surely his most complex and ambitious one. To quote from a Warner Brothers background paper on the director, it is a film that stretched him, in the old Scottish Puritan sense of the term, signifying that a man's reach should exceed his grasp, a resolve that hangs almost tangibly in the air around Anderson.
Sell, 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 sell everything you stand for. Tell, 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 tell all the people that you care for. Running here, running there, keep it moving, sonny, don't despair, because the next one will be, the next one will be, the next one will be the best one of the year.
This is program number 22 in the Sound on Film radio series, Oh Lucky Man and the Men Who Made It. Part 1, the film's director, Lindsay Anderson, talking with James Delson.
When you wrote your review of Buñuel's Adventures of Robinson Crusoe for Sight and Sound magazine, 1954, I believe, a line from your review says the first reels of the film are like the best kind of documentary. In everything you wrote about, you somehow managed to bring in documentary.
That was my background and my concern at the time. I do think also that documentary, when it's used creatively, is one of the purest and best forms of filmmaking, and can be one of the most personal kinds of filmmaking.
The quality of finding simple things and putting them on film, using your documentary background, but your dramatic presence at the moment, gives you the quality that you have in your films.
This idea of building up a whole out of a lot of small complementary or contrasting parts is in a way a more difficult thing perhaps to do in terms of a feature film. Perhaps that's been one of the things that's emerged from the progression from a picture like The White Bus through If to Oh Lucky Man in my filmmaking in the last, whatever it is, 5 or 6 years. I don't know whether it's really using a documentary background, because there are lots of documentary filmmakers who maybe haven't got this particular concentration on the single object or image, poetic idea of reality. I think it's very much the property of any poetic filmmaker to have this feeling for the image. After all, the film is founded on the image. Perhaps one of the weaknesses of modern filmmakers who've been trained not in the silent cinema, but often through television, is that in some way they lack this sense of how to tell a story through images, and they end up with the more generalized kind of image style of the fashionable photographer.
Oh, Lucky Man follows a lead that you just spoke of. One event links to another, the past to the present, person to person. And you took this one step further by linking all of these together, so the hero in Oh Lucky Man is faced with a person who we've seen in a past event performing a similar function in the present.
That's being a bit theoretical about it. It doesn't seem to me that in Oh Lucky Man, the repetition of actors is really linked to a consistent kind of characterization. We do often get the feeling in life that faces and personalities seem in some strange way to repeat themselves. The picture is a kind of fairy story, and I think I felt that this atmosphere, both absolutely real and yet a cartoon in a way, would be strengthened by having this repetition of faces.
Something you said when we were walking at Yale, as a matter of fact, was that it was to bring people back into knowing that it was a film they were watching instead of being so involved.
Which brings us to the rather dreaded word of alienation. I think it's a pity that no lighter or more humane word has been found for this quality, formulated, of course, by Brecht in his theoretical writing, which points up the side of film as, what should I say, a lesson or I was going to say demonstration. All of these sound very dry words, but I don't think it really is. It's
Parable,
constantly
perhaps, or fable?
a parable, a fable. Those are much better words, yes. They are constant reminders to the audience that they're watching a film.
This film is the closest thing yet to the perfect novel on the screen in the way that Fielding told Tom Jones. There is a narrator, there are chapter headings and chapter endings when you cut to black and when you have titles.
It's very interesting that. It certainly wasn't in my mind when we made the picture, but looking at the picture I think it's quite true.
Alan Price's music plays a major part in Oh Lucky Man. Plays a role, really.
I always have liked music. I think that music is a great energizer in a film, a lyric component, if you like, and it's something which, in the case of a long picture with many different episodes, can both bind the film together and propel it forward. That's one of the functions of music in the picture. It's a kind of rhythmic and dynamic function. The narrator is, in a sense, a properly cinematic kind of narrator in the person of the singer. It comes through the songs, the way that Alan Price wrote them and the way that he performs them, instead of being the perhaps rather more dead kind of narrator, such as was employed actually in the film of Tom Jones, where there was simply a disembodied voice on the soundtrack.
Until Lucky Man, Tom Jones had been the closest thing there was to a novel on the screen. Not an adapted novel the way
No.
To Kill a Mockingbird was, but really a novel on the screen.
Even if a film is like a film exists in time in a way that a novel doesn't. The development of what I would call an epic style rather than a novelistic style accommodates itself to a film of ideas rather than to the more traditional kind of film, which is based on a closely worked out plot or a psychological study of the characters, not seeing the characters emphatically in their social context, and, as I say, working the whole thing out in terms of ideas and rather than personalities.
In your film criticism, what you just said shows up the social conscience, really, of filmmakers, that you would generally praise people who tried to do something that was meaningful rather than just entertaining.
I don't think that one should really put meaning and entertainment in opposition.
I was trying to get into the piece you wrote on John Ford in 1950 concerning They Were Expendable.
They Were Expendable. If you want to see why, in relation to They Were Expendable, John Ford is a great filmmaker, where, for instance, someone like Fritz Lang can fail totally with exactly the same material, there is an extremely interesting parallel sequence in I think it's I Was an American Guerrilla in the Philippines, directed by Lang, and in it there is a sequence, it's as if they'd taken it out of the script of They Were Expendable, of the men receiving the news over the radio of the fall of Corregidor. And Lang does it without any feeling whatever, and Ford directs this sequence with complete simplicity, and it's absolutely masterly. When I interviewed John Ford in 1951, I started talking to him about They Were Expendable, and John Ford said, well, I've never seen that picture. He said, the only thing I can remember is that it was full of a lot of actors who wouldn't cut their hair to look like sailors. And I said to him, well, it's a great picture. And I remember that this was conducted in Maureen O'Hara's house in Dublin. And she came in at the end of the interview, and Ford actually turned to her and said, Maureen, you've been up to the house often and seen pictures up there. Have you ever seen me show a picture called They Were Expendable? And Maureen O'Hara thought for a moment. She said, no, I never have. So Ford turned to me and said, there you are. He said, I was telling the truth. 3 or 4 months later, I got a telegram from John Ford. Have seen They Were Expendable. You are right.
Do you stick to a script pretty closely once you start shooting?
Yes, pretty closely. Insofar as we can. I mean, sometimes in No Lucky Man, we did actually rewrite sequences, and there was at least one sequence we shot and I didn't like, and we rewrote it. I'm not a great believer in improvising.
The final sequence in Oh Lucky Man.
You mean the dance? Well, that was just grabbed.
The whole final sequence, I know that you had planned on him coming in and being discovered.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously the dialogue between Malcolm and myself is scripted and shot exactly to script.
Mm-hmm.
But then the music and the dancing, that was just improvised.
In theater, you must do a great deal of one-to-one working with the actors. Does this same thing happen when you work on a film?
The great drawback of the cinema is the tremendous time pressure that you have to work under. For instance, on Oh Lucky Man, we did a week's rehearsal, but it was very, very difficult because of the nature of the film and the number of different artists and the nature of the scenes, really. It was worth doing, but, as I say, it is very hard. I certainly think that it's advisable to rehearse for a film. I think it's, in the main, a good thing, though it depends a little bit on the subject. Some directors who don't like rehearsing like to do everything on the first take. I think it does depend very much on the kind of characterization that you're after in a film and how detailed you want it to be, and also the kind of actors you're working with. We didn't rehearse for If, and I think that if we had, it might have got a little bit too psychological. That's also a danger sometimes, that actors tend to try to turn everything into Chekhov. So you've got to be careful of that, particularly if you're working in what I'd call the epic style. But it certainly is rather agonizing if you have become used to working in the theatre to find yourself having to shoot scenes in the cinema before they're properly rehearsed. I don't want to bemoan the lot of the film director or myself as a film director too much, but it really is a kind of ordeal to go into, and I think that if you are a very subjective filmmaker and a very obsessive and personal filmmaker, that the struggle to maintain the personal note and the obsessive personal care for every detail through this incredibly clumsy machine that you have to work with in making a picture, that is the most enormous struggle, and therefore one doesn't willingly undertake it or lightly undertake it.
How will you look upon criticism of Oh Lucky Man?
You find that you know your film much better than anybody else. You know its defects better than anybody else, and perhaps you understand its virtues. I think it's very rare that one can learn anything from journalistic criticism, and most criticism is journalistic, which means that it has to be very condensed, it's rather short, and unfortunately it also means, and this is particularly the case with young critics, that the critic is above all trying to make an impression. The temptation to say the memorable, cutting thing is very great. Like Dorothy Parker, was it about Katharine Hepburn? It's always quoted. She ran the gamut of emotions from A to B.
I wondered if you could give us the reason why you made Oh Lucky Man?
It had in it the seeds of a film that would be able to make a varied and, I think, quite important and comic comment on life today, which is a good function for a film, I think. That's why I allowed it to grow and helped it to grow and finally committed myself to it. As for what the film does or accomplishes, I think that, I've got to leave it to other people to tell me.
Everyone is going through changes, and no one knows what's going on. And everybody changes places, but the world still carries on. Love must always change to sorrow, and everyone must play the game. It's here today and gone tomorrow, but the world goes on the same.
From Oh Lucky Man's director Lindsay Anderson, sound and film moves to the film's star, Malcolm McDowell. In the 4 years since If, Malcolm McDowell has become one of the motion picture world's outstanding young actors. The mysterious youth on the run in Joseph Losey's Figures in a Landscape. The edgy, sensitive paraplegic in Brian Forbes' Long Ago Tomorrow. The violent, amoral Alex in Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Before films, Malcolm McDowell trained with the Stratford Shakespeare Company. And before going on the stage, he was a young coffee salesman. The experiences of that time serving as the genesis for an original film idea, which he called Coffee Man. Working with David Sherwin, who scripted If and became responsible for this screenplay, and Lindsay Anderson, his first film director, in developing his Coffee Man idea, McDowell casually remarked one day, the hero of our film is lucky. At that moment, Coffee Man became Oh Lucky Man. This is Oh Lucky Man and the Men Who Made It, Part 2, the film's star Malcolm McDowell talking with James Delson.
When did you get the original idea for Coffee Man?
I was a coffee salesman for the Chase and Sanborn. When I became an actor and I worked at Stratford-upon-Avon, I decided that perhaps I could write down some of these experiences in letter form because I hadn't really had any experience of a film script at that time. Time passed. And then I did If with Lindsay Anderson, and I thought that I'd really like to work with him again. He's a marvelous director, and he became a very good friend. After If, I went off to Spain to work with Joseph Losey in a film called Figures in a Landscape. When I came back, I started to write it in script form. It was basically the adventures of this coffee salesman striving for success, or what he thought was success. I remember having a meeting with David Sherwin. And he said, well, what have you been up to? And I said, well, I've got this script that I'm working on. He said, oh, I'd like to read it.
Was it full length at this time?
It was just a progression of scenes, mostly autobiographical, some not. But it mainly went up to the atomic power station in the film.
That wasn't autobiographical.
You can't say that any of it is autobiographical, really. I mean, one just uses experiences of 10 years ago and pushes them as far as the truth will stretch. That's basically what I did at that point. When I was looking for this atomic research establishment, in real life, I found it parked outside, a little way up from these huge gates with barbed wire all over them, and I was writing up my notes leaning against my car door, which was opened suddenly by 2 military policemen. And they marched me back to this, I guess it's a guard room or gatehouse, pulled out all the samples and dumped them all over the forecourt. In the film, of course, the whole thing blows up and he's interrogated and tortured by the electric shock treatment and all the rest of it. The system would be that I would tell David the stories and we'd go through it, work on dialogue and stuff and try and get a shape and then try and push it as far as we could go. And that's basically the original idea for that particular scene, and we'd do that with other scenes as well.
What shape was it in when you brought it to Lindsay Anderson?
Well, Lindsay did actually read what the very same material that David read. He'd been encouraging me to write this stuff, you know. He'd been saying to me, like, don't talk, write. And at that time, of course, although I knew he was going to direct it, I'm damn sure he didn't know.
He didn't know.
No. But it was a very slow, conning process. David would come and see me, and then he'd go to see Lindsay, he'd come back to me, and he would take my ideas to Lindsay, and he'd bring in Lindsay's ideas to me, and this went on for at least a year. At that time, I went off to do Clockwork Orange with Mr. Kubrick. After I'd finished Clockwork Orange, I took a house for the summer near Oxford, and I got this phone call from Lindsay who said, I think the whole thing is cancelled. The author is lying drunk on the floor. And I thought, oh my God, you know, it's terrible, disaster. That was on a Friday night, and on the Sunday, Lindsay phoned back and he said, it's okay, we did some very good work today. Thank God.
David
Well,
wrote this all up in the introduction to the book.
From a rough beginning, which was called Coffee Man, to, I suppose, a first draft was a year's hard work, really.
At this time, did they start pulling together all the technicians and the crew?
No. At this point, Alan got a synopsis of the script and started to write the songs way before we started to shoot the first frame.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, all the songs, except one, I think, were recorded before we started shooting. The places were marked out where the songs should come, and David had written various lyrics that he thought were lyrics, you know. And they weren't too bad, but Alan didn't like them. Anyway, he changed them completely, and he just did his own thing, and he worked it out how he felt it.
Lindsay refers to Oh Lucky Man's construction as epic. What would you say epic means in this case?
An odyssey, a journey of this character. All the scenes can be taken on many different levels. You can take it purely on a narrative level. The story of simply a young man striving for success. I think every scene has a different dimension to it, pulling in other directions. I think also that the fact that Alan and his music, his band, become a kind of Greek chorus, and also that various actors play more than one role in the film. For instance, Ralph Richardson plays a little tailor in Yorkshire, and then comes back as a big tycoon businessman later on in the film. Rachel Roberts has 2 parts, I think, and Arthur Lowe has 3 roles.
You are listening to Oh Lucky Man and the Men Who Made It, the latest in a series of broadcasts on films and the people who make them, which continues in a moment. This is Sound on Film. Today's Sound on Film program focuses on Warner Brothers' Oh Lucky Man, with cinema commentator James Delson talking with the film's director Lindsay Anderson, its composer Alan Price, and at the moment continuing his conversation with Oh Lucky Man's star Malcolm McDowell.
In her review of the film, Judith Christ pointed out, and Lindsay did not agree, I was wondering what you thought about it, that several of the characters who did appear again and again seemed to be playing almost the same role. She said that Ralph Richardson was a philosopher, one way or the other, that Rachel Roberts was the put-upon woman, the all-suffering woman, that Arthur Lowe was the power figure in each position he played.
That's actually basically true, except it was not planned that way. People in life reoccur. I mean, they may not be exactly the same people, but you feel that you've met them before, that type, and we all get that feeling from one time to another.
Many of the events in the film actually happened to people in the cast and crew. Of course, the whole beginning was from your past, and the Atomic Research Center section was something like something you'd gone through. Lindsay had said that when he was in Alan's van, he had thought of using the van sequence in your film. You had said something about reading an article in one of the London papers about the Medical Research Center, and Alan had gone to something like a sex club.
In any work of art, and I have no hesitation in calling this film a work of art, one has to use one's own experience, and as it is a collaborative medium that we're working in, anybody's experience is valid. For instance, I remember asking Lindsay how the hell I was going to end the film, and he said, well, just do whatever happened to you. I mean, what happened to you? And I said, oh, well, I don't know, I became an actor and I, did If. He said, there you are, you did If, right, just, that's it, the audition for If, and that's it. That small little piece of information grew into something very different, but basis of truth is always there in all the scenes.
Your role required a great deal of reacting more than acting, which you've done mostly in your other films.
It is much more a reacting role, I think. I really hate to use these words, actually, because they're very confusing.
People understand.
One of the dangers that I felt about this particular character was that he could be very passive. You can't watch a film of this length in this particular style if he is passive, because it would be, I think, very boring. So I tried to energize it as much as I could. The momentum in the film is generated by other people, and he is a victim of them all the time. Whereas, for instance, in a film like Clockwork Orange, the character of Alex is the motivator of it, and everything that happens in the particular scenes or in the film itself happen because of him and what he says and does. And that's the difference, really.
Well, you said in this case that you were more the catalyst for the characters in the
That's
film.
right, I think so, yeah.
The character in the original film, Coffee Man, was he as naive as Mick was in there?
Yeah, you're very naive. I tell you, the problem was, my experience, Mick would enter and sit down, and then you'd have the dialogue between the other characters, and at the end of the scene, Mick would up and go out. Well, that's not too good. You had to doctor it up a bit, and really work on that. I think David did that very successfully with Lindsay.
How much of the film was put together on the spot? Was it completely scripted?
Well, yes, I think Lindsay likes to start from a very solid base, and he was to try and get the script in as a shape as possible. Of course, I don't think there's ever been a film shot exactly as scripted. This film, all we seemed to do was cut out sections that we'd need.
When working on the film with Robert Off, Figures in the Landscape, it was almost rewritten on a day basis.
And that was terrible. But I don't know, I think there's a lot to be said for some scenes being improvised in film. Clockwork Orange, a lot of it was improvised. We'd control the improvisation, so we'd improvise it, and then tape the whole thing, type it all out, and look at it, and then cut out the bits that sort of floundered or were repetitive. You couldn't really do it with an experienced actor. No Lucky Man didn't really do that at all, because most of the scenes were set.
We were at Yale, you told a story about the gold suit.
This gold suit thing actually happened, and I did live in some digs in Leeds, actually. When I first arrived there, I remember sitting down in the dining room, and there was a strange man across me, who was a tailor in town. White, he asked me, I'm Sherry, and he said, I've got something for you, And he opened this zipper bag, and there was this old suit, the most hideous thing I'd ever seen in my life. He said, come on, let's go and drink round the pub. Have you ever been in Leeds, which is a very hard town, to say the least? Gold suit. I got a few whistles, I can tell you.
The character of Mick seemed, when I first saw it, to be very much like Tom Jones or Candide. Like the film is a novel, with the musical narration, the way that Jones was narrated.
Yeah.
With the cuts to black as chapter endings and the titles as chapter endings.
Like saying, this is a great script, but it's a great film. There are no great scripts, only great films. Novel's a novel, and film is a film. It is episodic, like Tom Jones. I don't think the characters particularly like Tom Jones, although they do have certain similarities. When Albert Finney first saw Oh Lucky Man, he said that it's very interesting. He knew exactly the problems playing a role like this because he'd been through the same thing on Tom Jones, and I was stunned. When he was shooting Tom Jones, it was the same kind of thing. He was reacting all the time, and these most actors were coming in,
Doing their stuff.
doing their bit, off they go, their lovely cameos, and it was very unsatisfying to do. And he said, the interesting thing is that actor, he knows that he can appreciate when he sees himself actually acting a role, and he can see the way he's stretching himself, and that's satisfying to watch that. What's very difficult and impossible to understand is your own personality coming on the screen. If you take that for granted, you just feel, well, there's nothing happening. Of course, that's not how the audience sees it. I suppose it's because you know yourself, and you know within reason your own personality. And it's very difficult to appreciate how other people see you. I guess he's right, and so it's comforting to hear that.
It seemed to me that both Tom Jones and Mick are very naive, but reasonably sharp in their dealings with people.
Well, I think this is the style. The style of the character has to correspond absolutely to the style of the film. It's difficult talking about one work and what you do, but it has to be played in a certain broad style, which you cannot take on a realistic base at all. But it has to be, really have to believe it. It's like reading a fairy story. You actually go along with Cinderella. You actually do believe that, the coat turns into a pumpkin at 12 o'clock. And that's the same thing. You just go along with it, because emotionally, you believe it. You see, it is like a fairy story after all, an Odyssey. It's, Pilgrim Progress and Voltaire's Candide. It's not a literal film. You can't take it on a little basis. The thing is, it's always got to be real, never realistic.
So smile while you're making it, laugh while you're taking it, even though you're faking it, nobody's gonna know.
From Lucky Man's star, Malcolm McDowell, sound on film moves to the film's singer-composer, Alan Price. Its blackouts between scenes, its actors and repertoire, its multitudinous events, its abruptly episodic format. Oh Lucky Man extends the use of cinema. Time called the film brash, eclectic, innovative, deeply personal. Those are adjectives. What is probably its most striking thematic innovation, its use of music and song to comment on action, and at times, become a part of it. This unique commentator's role is filled by Alan Price, whose skiffle, rock, blues, jazz, piano led in 1963 is forming the successful British rhythm and blues group, The Animals. Later came another group, the Alan Price, and then Alan Price and Friends on British television. Price makes his film debut with Oh Lucky Men, singing the songs that have brought him universal acclaim for the manner in which they brought together to comment on the narrative. Of all the elements that contribute to the structure of Oh Lucky Men, director Anderson says the music first.
Down on the corner of the street where I was born, we used to and sing old songs. We called them Dole songs.
Billboard, the music industry's main paper, says that perhaps the most vital aspect of the is the role of an English music performer-writer commands what amounts to second billing. Knowing that Anderson cut Price hushed over his electric piano throughout the film, Billboard calls it genuinely Brechtian, a valid departure from the usual tendency to simply run the tracks beneath screen action. The score itself, says Billboard, is nearly perfect in fulfilling both Price's musical criteria and Anderson's dramatic and thematic needs, with the playing machine emphasizing the simple but incisive lyrics. Sam Southern, writing for Billboard, concludes, Price's score, not least by the way on Warner Brothers records, is a triumph and should serve as a fine model for future attempts at fusing the sensibilities of music with the demands of film. One might add that Anderson's conception of the role of music in this picture and Price's execution of it will leave their mark beyond its immediate effect on this one, extending as it does the languid film itself.
Things are so very different now. Two folk must get along somehow. You live forever on the never, never. Back in my hometown.
This is Oh Lucky Man and the Men Who Made It, Part 3. The musical composer, former Alan Tuss, talking with James Delson.
Oh Lucky Man, very interesting piece of work because the film and music were done at the same time. This has only been done twice as far as in 3D opera was used, like somewhat. Music generally has always been ordered after the film.
When Lynn approached me to do the music for the film, he said he would like to use the music in a Brechtian sense. The music would not be superimposed on the film. The group would be shown performing. And my job as a performer would not only be singing the songs, but to be used to comment on the action. I was nervous at the thought of making one with such giants as Mr. McDowell and Anderson. I asked him if it would be possible, as soon as they had finished the script, for them to send to me all the appropriate plays and give me some idea of the full speed of the song, so I could get it in first, record it, so they accept it and get used to it for changing it before they shot the film, and they allowed me to do that.
Your music fits each specific section of the film. The point when he's going out on the road as a salesman, a song called Sell.
Sell, 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 and then you stand for. Tell the people that you kept on. Run here, right now, you're moving, son, and don't despair, because the next one will be, the next one will be, the next one will be the best one of the year.
At other moments, Anderson cuts to you and he lets you get the whole song on screen. Was this done for a specific purpose?
To give you time to catch your breath, I feel. The proportion of the film demands that you have absorbed a lot of information. There's a song driven on the action, and something melodic gives you a chance to catch your breath.
How do you go about getting the music? You just generally sit down at a typewriter or piano, bang away? Or?
No, well, I leave it till the last minute. I operate on the hard motive.
You write music or lyrics for it?
One can come before the other. It depends. There is a song called Listus, which I wrote, which was in a certain part where it expresses both mine and I think Lindsay's philosophy on the idea that the only people that get justice are those who are prepared to pay for it. For instance, there's never been a billionaire executed for murder in the United States. I couldn't find anything to hang it on, and I dug out an old lyric which I'd written about 2 years ago, which is called Easy Money. Then I wrote a tune to fit that lyric, and after I got tune, I changed the words. So there was a reverse logic.
We all want justice, you got to have money to buy it. You'd have to be a fool to close your eye and deny it. There's a lot of poor people who are walking the streets of my town, trying to see that justice is used to do right down. On life from beginning to end, pay your monthly installments. Next to health is wealth, and only wealth whereby you justice. And money, justice, money, and justice, money, justice.
Your music in the film is rather ironic at many points in the way it's intercut the film. Were you driving for this, or was this note was put into the film originally?
It shows the depth of Lindsay's inspiration, and he knew exactly what we wanted to convey, and I helped him, and he filmed it accordingly. I mean, he just do a lot of planning. If it hadn't for Lindsay's enthusiasm and the help of everybody, I don't think I would have had, the folks. The thing is, it's very difficult to record these days without having a project in mind. It's easy to lump a bunch of songs together and put them out on an album, but this is much easier in that it helps you to focus your idea.
Which was the easiest one to write?
Well, change. Again, it showed the depth of Lindsay's research, and that he followed me and when we were making boards and concepts. A friend of mine called Zoopman, he's a blues artist who's been on the in for a long time. At the time that I was recording, he was going through a very rough period, so I helped out by giving a session, and I made up these words called changes, the first verse, to the tune of What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And we were lucky that Lindsay was hiding behind one of the screens and it all down, instead he would like to use it in a certain place in the film, and that was completely spontaneous.
Everyone is going through dangers, no one knows what's going on. Everybody changes faces, but the world still carries on. Love must always change to sorrow, and everyone must play the game. It's here today and gone tomorrow, but the world goes on the same. Now love must always change to sorrow, and everyone must play the game. It's here today and gone tomorrow, but the world goes on the same.
All numbers come at specific moments of film. I think the song more than any other sums a whole metamorphosis Mick goes through. Poor people.
We were taught.
Hope it will emerge as the most memorable song of 1973.
Poor people, they don't understand. A man's got to meet whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people, stay poor people, they never to see. Someone's got to win in the human race, living in you, and it has to be. So smile while you're making it, laugh while you're taking it. Even though you're making it, nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know.
What do you look upon as your role in the film? Part of a narrator or the part of the chorus?
I don't think I'm quite so specific. My purpose in film is only to illustrate in music what I'm doing in other poems.
David Sheridan, in the introduction to the script that is just published, talks about the experiences that one went through that were put into the film, and he mentioned the sex club scene when Mick is a salesman. He said you went through an experience like that yourself.
Well, I did in a northern town in England, a spa resort, which I won't name. And after I did the gig, I went to stay in a hotel, which was run by the mayor of this particular town. And he asked me if I was interested in films. I said, no, not particularly, but I'll try once. And he said that I swapped films with certain artists and things, and have a lovely little scene in the back garden, a little shed. And because I'm the mayor, and because I know everybody here, I can get out to other little girls who are underage, and I inveigle them down the path, down to the bottom, and sort of compromise them, and we have nice scenes, and all the local nurseries come down there. And it just stuck in my mind.
Incredible. It came off very disgustingly in the film. That was what he was reached for, certainly to make it. The music sequences, sometimes, seemed to me, were planned so that the audience, while watching film, would be made aware that they were in a movie theatre, rather than just being absorbed and they're watching on the screen.
I'm aware about that. Film is a true word in that it makes you question the reality of life, and people don't like to ask the questions. I think that the effect on an audience is actually make them question their values. In London, where the film is showing, the last section of the sequence where the hero is down and out and wandering the streets is actually in the same square in which the set is showing.
That's your square.
The constant juxtaposition of reality, naturalism, and film, it's very loving.
Was any music changed last minute so it fit?
When I saw a compilation of all the sequencing with the music, I had a feeling that there was a point the film didn't need a song, where there'd been a rather large gap, where there was concentrated tension, which hadn't been relieved. And you felt this could be the sequence where Malcolm or Mick, they're interchangeable, feel that they're on the verge of success, true success. That's the feel that's going to make it. And I've had that feel myself. So I said, I think it'd be easy for me to write something about that, and hence have Lower Your Shoulder.
When there's a bluebird sitting by your window pane, and the sun shines bright all day through, don't get bored, look over your shoulder, 'cause there's always someone cleaning at you. La 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 la, la la la. Hope springs eternal in a young man's breast, and dreams of a better life ahead. Out there dreaming, you want nothing, nothing, nothing. You have to find out for yourself that dream is dead. La 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 la.
Beatles film. Their time, it was a very creative use of music. There was a whole flush of pop rock stuff at the time, and Les did some very original stuff with that. Do you think that this might off a whole new trend in film music?
Only if there are enough talented people to do it, and directors who would be able to use it, probably. Maybe there's always a spate of film. If this is successful, they'll try the same thing.
It's fascinating that after the Beatles film, there were a bunch of that kind of stuff. And
but not many more successful.
I don't think anywhere. And the same with Butch Cassidy, where the music was so perfectly attuned to the film. Since then, even Backer has written music for the film, which seems to fall flat. It's just everybody wants to run the bandwagon.
No, I think it's just by nature of film industry. But it's not called organized to a great extent. There's a gap between the artists and the promoters, as in any scene. You know, I mean, artists are not that good on their own work, and producers aren't that really understand the artistic element of it.
You could be interested in doing music again for 50 years.
It takes a charity. It took 2 years, and I can't ever spend the time.
Well, looking back on this, though, do you think it was a worthwhile experience? Or did it bring you new horizons? And
no, it's just marvellous. I made marvellous performances with the animals. I was proud of, and we actually did a good deal of work. But there's no preserve from some terrible TV shows where it was mimed to hit reps. I have a daughter, she's only 2 years old now, and if there's anything to be proud to show, I really treat it. Good stand up. It's a stir film, and it really serves its purpose, and I think it's a job work. Really proud of being associated with it. It stands for something.
You think you can lie, you are lucky man. And if you got reasons, the morning I die, you are lucky man. The preachers and the poets, the stars don't know it. The devils and the statues, people won't show it. If you got the secret, just try to know they're lucky man.
With composer Al Price, guitar Malcolm McDowell, and director Lindsay Anderson, in conversation with film commentator James Delson, this ends Sound on Film program number 22, Oh Lucky Man, The Men Who Did It, recorded at various times, April and June 1973, during the American premiere of Oh Lucky Man at University New Haven and New York City. Music was broadcast from the soundtrack recording of Oh Lucky Man on Warner Brothers Records. Sound on program made possible for a wide audience through pushing Grand Motion to injury. Today's sound film program was by Phil Farkas, technical director, whose case was made possible in part by grant from Warner Brothers Incorporated. Sound film broadcasts are produced under complete independent control of Irwin Finkel Productions.
It had in it the seeds of a film that would be able to make a varied and, I think, quite important and comic comment on life today.
You see, it is like a fairy story after all, an odyssey. You can't take it on a literal basis. The thing is that you've always got to be real, but never realistic.
I have a daughter, and she's only 2 years old now, and if there's anything I wanted to be proud of to show her what I really tried to do, this would stand up.
This is the Sound on Film Radio Network.